Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the third installment of our new online Dornsife Dialogue weekly series. We've been using this platform to talk to our experts about how the pandemic is affecting various aspects of our lives. We started with politics and family life, and today our experts are going to help us think through how the pandemic is likely to affect the future of art and our cultural institutions more broadly. We have a terrific panel today. In only 3 individuals, we have expertise that goes from studio art to curation, criticism, art history, art business management, and entrepreneurialism. So if this set of folks can't help us make sense of how the art world is going to weather COVID-19, I'm not sure that anybody is going to give us that perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to make some introductions. Our first panelist is Enrique Martinez Celaya. He is a Provost Professor of Humanities and Arts at USC Dornsife and a renowned painter and writer whose work has been exhibited around the world. He brings a truly unique mindset, which explores the ties between art, science, and philosophy. Celaya studied physics at Cornell, which is familiar to me as I'm a physicist. Earned his master's degree in quantum electronics from UC Berkeley, and then pivoted and got an MFA at UC Santa Barbara. In addition to serving on the faculty at USC Dornsife and also at USC Roski, Celaya regularly presents public lectures. He invites young scholars to participate in art activities. He maintains his studio practice in Culver City, and he is a terrific citizen of USC Dornsife. So thank you again, Enrique, for being here with us. Our second guest is Andy Campbell. Andy is a professor of critical studies at the USC Roski School of Art and Design. He is an art and design historian whose work is cited at the juncture of identity-based political movements, their visual cultures, and arts histories. Described as a telling and visual tapestry of an emerging LGBTQ language and identity, his book, Queer X Design, 50 Years of Signs, Symbols, Banners, Logos, and the Graphic Art of LGBTQ, was released in May of 2019. His second book, Bound Together, Leather, Sex, Archives, and Contemporary Art, released in January of 2020, examines artists who draw imagery and inspiration from leather archives to fashion a queer politics of the present. His academic writings and art criticism can be found in Artiforum, GLQ, Rhizomes, and Aperture, amongst others. He lives in Long Beach, California, and is an assistant professor of critical studies at USC's Roski School of Art and Design. And finally, as our moderator, we have Jonathan Neal. He's the founding director of the Center for Business and Management of the Arts at Claremont Graduate University. And for more than a decade, he's taught in, built, and led academic programs specializing in art, criticism, markets, and entrepreneurship. Not at all what his advisors at Columbia thought he would do when they handed him his PhD in art history, I suspect. And on the side, he's written and edited books, magazines, and museum catalogs, started businesses, and advised artists, collectors, and startups on how not to take the art world or themselves too seriously. And for those astute among you who notice that the bookshelves in the background in our 2 screens are not so dissimilar, fun fact, he also happens to be my husband. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Neal.
Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity. Enrique, Andy, thank you for joining me in this. And I want to thank everybody at USC Dornsife for putting together this discussion today on how pandemics will affect the arts, not just here in Los Angeles, but everywhere. I want to begin this conversation just by asking Enrique and Andy how they're doing, how the quarantine has been affecting them, and how they're managing both personally, and then we'll get into the professional landscape very quickly.
Well, luckily I'm healthy and well, and my kids are healthy. So that's a big deal. I mean, I think people are struggling with this, but definitely life has changed, both in the studio and personally, like it has for most of us. I'm sure we'll get into the details of how so, but.
Absolutely, absolutely. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I'm doing okay, all things considered, with the acknowledgement, like Enrique said, of, that's not the situation for everyone. But yeah,
Good.
grateful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm glad we could have this conversation. This is I suspect a conversation that the three of us and many others have been having both online and offline in a number of different contexts. And so I think I'm very happy to be able to share it with a larger audience here. Enrique, as a practicing artist with a fairly full forward calendar, I imagine just 6 weeks ago, what does the situation on the ground look like for you? How has this changed the way that your studio is operating, the way that you are operating, and the way that you're thinking about your practice now, perhaps a little bit differently today than you might have been even as early as 5 or 6 weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, it has been transformative. All my talks for the spring have been canceled. All my both galleries and museum projects have been either canceled or postponed. So a calendar was very, very full 6 weeks ago, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to complete all the projects I had signed up for. Suddenly, it's a very open calendar. Studio visits have stopped, obviously. We usually have museums or collectors coming by. So it has been a tremendous change. Also a change in the stability one feels from the art world and galleries getting nervous. I think like many people in general, but artists in particular, is, we tend to work in isolation quite often. But this isolation has sort of magnified in such a way that it's very easy to feel alienated. So I think, like many artists, we have responded the studio have responded by doing some live things, inviting people to the studio that way, and things like this webinar.
I know that the studio plays a particularly significant role, not just as a place of work for you, but also as an idea, as a metaphor, as an extension of your thinking. How has that begun to change or transform or evolve as this time that you've been given to both work there, but also to think there and to imagine what it's going to be like in the future? If you give us maybe just a little bit of insight into what the studio means to you as an artist now, both physically and metaphorically.
I mean, I constructed this studio and all my studios as a support system, some sort of machine for living to help me make decisions and choices. And I think in a situation like this, all of that comes back to me as a benefit. So the studio has been a place of support when things have felt quite loose, quite elusive. I think the studio have given me a certain grounding that I needed. My assistants and I have been here. We keep social distancing and wear masks and gloves, but we have a sense of community. We're trying to do something in the middle of this pandemic. So the studio have actually been a huge source of support. And the work itself, and the making of artworks, the making of paintings and sculptures is something that we always assume that we are creating, but quite often the opposite is happening. They are creating who we are and our sense of identity, especially in a moment like this one, which our sense of identity tends to become less defined because many of the things that we did before the pandemic we're not doing anymore. So it has been good in that way.
It's a very interesting way of thinking about it. This notion that these kinds of crises have a tendency to hone one's vision or have a tendency to reduce one down to the fundamentals of one's practice or the fundamentals of one's thinking. Andy, I want to ask you something a little bit similar. We know that in the past, these kinds of conditions, pandemic conditions, crisis conditions, have also driven artists out from the studio, right? Away from the internalized practice towards a re-engagement with the social. That's been difficult in the current condition, given the necessities of the quarantine and the requirements of social distancing. But could you give us a little bit of insight into what this has looked like in the past and in some of the ways that you've seen it happening now in the current conditions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, artists are going to find a way to shape their responses to this particular crisis, and that work is going on now and will be ongoing. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't look back, to historically how artists have related to pandemics, both that have touched their personal lives and the lives of those they love, and even those that they don't know, right? And for me, one of the greatest historical examples of that is artists working with, thinking through the AIDS pandemic, which is still ongoing today. It's not a thing of the past, right? Like it's still, we're living in two pandemics simultaneously. And so I think to kind of help kind of set a stage for that, I have a few images that I would love to kind of show of artists
Sure.
and the way that they kind of have responded to this. And maybe I can just spend 5 minutes kind of rolling through some of that, if that's okay.
Please do.
Yeah, okay. So I am of the mindset that, the way that we, how we do illness, how we respond to illness is a political act, right? And in this respect, I kind of take my cues from someone like Lisa Diedrich, or from Tacoma Action Collective, which is a collective of artists who are responding at first to an exhibition of AIDS artwork. But, I think that the responses are broad and they're deep, right? And they can look like a lot of different things. So at its most basic level, artists respond, to what the conditions around them are from their own bodies and what they might ingest or not, like Ben Cuevas's knit PrEP pills, right? To communities. We see somebody like Nan Golden imaging all of the kind of people in her extended network of communities. They also work in coordination, and I think we will see this happen more and more. They're going to be working in coordination with nonprofit and government institutions to aid in health campaigns. Sometimes that work is considered to be conceptually an artwork itself, and sometimes that's like spec work that they're paid for. Either way, they should be paid for it, right? So Kim Abeliz's HIV Tarot that has kind of bilingual information on the back, or Glenn Ligon's broadside for visual aids. This is an image that not a lot of people talk about when they talk about Glenn Ligon's practice, but it's certainly kind of in his background. It's something that he kind of did to respond to a crisis that was ongoing during the time that he made this. Artists are also responsible for some of the major graphics and images that we attach to something like the AIDS pandemic. So the Silence Equals Death project is made up of a group of artists and designers who created this really iconic, design that has been used to advocate for greater access to treatment and care and greater thoughtfulness in the kind of political body at large. And we also have artists who refocus us, right? Who kind of interrupt our staid notions of thinking about things. So Ted Kerr with his AIDS 1969 graphic, which points to some of the earliest cases in the United States. Robert Rayford, a St. Louis teenager in 1969, which kind of decimates a lot of timelines that we work with around the AIDS crisis. And then someone like Demian Dinayasha, who's a Dine artist who connects pandemics with the post-apocalyptic world for indigenous folks, right, after 1492, right? So there's a way in which artists are also drawing connections between cultural productions. They include kind of signifiers from their own cultural vantage points, but also kind of address poetics and aesthetics. Masami Teraoka with these kind of woodblock prints that respond to kind of the AIDS pandemic, and Tourmaline's video, Atlantic as a Sea of Bones, which is available I think on both Artforum and Visual Aid's website, which is really quite remarkable. And they use strategy, like various strategies that we find them using in their art, right? Like, so everything from representation, photographic representation in this part, in this example, to abstraction, right? To think about kind of both the stakes of the epidemic or the pandemic and also kind of what it does to our sense of self and our sense of society, which is what Enrique was talking about, right? We can add Derek Jarman's Blue to that. And they also understand that images are an important way in which we understand the world, right? And so images can be, especially today, and especially as we are isolated and alone at home and kind of sharing information, right? Images are one of the things that we share and trade amongst ourselves. So artists have a great understanding of how images can go viral, to kind of take that idiomatic phrase and kind of put some literalness to it. But they also understand that the strategies of yesterday are not the strategies of today, right? And that there's going to be a different gloss on kind of what they produce ultimately. They pay tribute to their loved ones. So something like Laura Aguilar's altar to the poet Gil Quadros, or Jerome Caja's paintings, in this case, that include the ashes of his friend Charles Sexton. So it's literally a kind of tomb, memorial, and painting kind of all at once, right? And they also make sure that the next generation of artists can live and can thrive. And so we see lots of efforts on the part of people who interface with the AIDS pandemic to support and give voice to marginalized communities, especially within the pandemic and the discourse around the pandemic, but also, thinking about generational transmission. So Jonathan Molina Garcia's work, where he literally has older men kind of teach him certain skills, right, that then he carries forward as an artist. And I just want to point out before I kind of unshare my screen, right? That artists are doing this now with the COVID-19 response. So a great place for those who might be tuning in who are artists to go is this website, COVID-19 freelance artist resource.wordpress. It is a great aggregator for all of the resources that have become kind of available for artists in the wake of this crisis. So, artists are essential interlocutors in our response to pandemics. I mean, that would be my big takeaway.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
I think it's a great sort of set of a context to put beside what's happening currently, and it brings to mind that part of this is a crisis, as a health crisis, is an interesting one in distinction from what we saw with the AIDS crisis, because right now there is a public health crisis for sure in the response, but there's also an economic one.
Yeah.
And we know that this is coming for the arts and cultural infrastructure in a way that that we haven't seen before, right? In a way that other even non-health related crises like 2008's financial crisis haven't really had an effect. So we don't know what's going to happen. I'm curious to ask you, sort of, it seems almost as if, in a way, looking backwards, that the roles are now flipped. How is it that artists are going to be able to support, revive, draw attention to the institutional framework, which may be the thing that is actually most at risk here, rather than in prior moments, certain artistic communities or certain artistic practices or visibility for certain types of artists or certain types of communities and more generally in the public eye. I'm very curious to get your thoughts, maybe Andy first and then Enrique, yeah, where you see the institutional landscape getting its support going forward, and what we have to keep in mind as we imagine the post-pandemic future.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to pay attention to all the moving parts right now. And I think one of the things that we can do is help each other to kind of become aware of various institutions' situation and also the situation of artists itself. I mean, I would kind of flip your question a little bit, because I think, artists, because of a lot of reasons that we could spend a whole other hour kind of going into, have been disinvested in kind of society and culture at large. And so I would kind of be hesitant to place the onus on artists to help out arts institutions. Usually both are working on limited sets of funds and funding, right? So I think the question needs to become, how do the people who are so excited about supporting, say, programs at arts institutions, or, and this is a funder base, this is a donor base, how can they come in and ensure that museums are not laying off non-essential workers, that galleries are able to kind of maintain, right? Like, I think like it's really kind of that community in this case that has the economic and financial resources to really kind of do something economically for institutions, right? But when we're talking about kind of culturally, artists are already kind of participating in fundraising efforts for institutions. They're doing the things that they've always done, donating artworks, often gratis, so that an institution can kind of raise funds. They are building coalitionally with one another to make sure that everybody has housing and food and kind of the resources they need to live. I do think, like you're saying, Jonathan, that this is just gonna shift our landscape in ways that we can't yet imagine. We've seen museums lay off non-essential art workers and part-time art workers here in LA. The MoCA layoffs are a great example of that. And it's complicated. On one hand, that allows their staff to get access to unemployment benefits, but on the other hand, it gives an extra dimension of precarity to a lot of art workers and cultural workers' lives who, already were existing in precarity, right? So I think, for those of us who have the privilege and financial stability, to be okay during this crisis, to come back to your first question, Jonathan, how are we? I think it is our responsibility to make sure that we are doing everything we can economically, culturally, intellectually, when we have the energy, when we find ourselves with the energy to support not only artists, but also their institutions at various levels.
I think that's well said. Enrique, how are you seeing this transformation of the institutional landscape? This is one that you're intimately familiar with, given the numbers of exhibitions and the curatorial cohorts that you regularly interact with in order to plan for future projects and so forth. I imagine this is an interesting moment to have those conversations.
It is. I mean, all the museums I'm involved with are struggling. They are finding that donors have sort of thinned out or disappeared. Yeah. At times. They have to maintain typically big staff, and they don't know really how to do it, especially when they're closed. I've talked to a few museum directors that are trying to make these difficult decisions every day, who to keep employed and how long. No one knows. I mean, part of the complexity of this moment is that there's a lot of unknowns in the future. I mean, there may be another pandemic coming in the winter, right, which will change this dynamic again to a whole other level. I think this is a transformative period. Very tough times are ahead for artists. I mean, artists are always, most artists are always struggling, usually having a secondary form of a job. Institutions are always struggling. Galleries are month-to-month operations a lot of the time. So now galleries are going to close. A lot of galleries are going to close. And with that, we'll take the opportunity for artists to exhibit. And it's also, many of them are going to take the artist money, that many artists who are owed money, galleries are going to take that money with them, exacerbating the situation that many artists are facing. We're going to see collectors sort of pull away from the art market, which is going to mean less support for institutions, less support for artists, less commissions, less publications. In museums, if they stay open, may not decide not to do publications accompanying exhibitions, which of course that is a tremendous loss for all of us. So I think that we're going to have the alternative spaces are going to be some of the most hurt institutions, because usually the alternative spaces are working with smaller budgets, quite often struggling to keep the spaces open. So now what's going to happen? And I think this pain is going to be felt not just now. I mean, I think a lot of people talk about recovery and you read all these economic predictions of recovery. I think for artists and for institutions, this is just the beginning of a period of a lot of pain, which, like I said, if we have another pandemic or another economic downturn, is going to become much worse. And then the question of how can artists support institutions, I think artists will support institutions partly conceptually by rethinking ways of interacting with the public, by doing things like what we're doing today. But it's going to be, I think we're all in the same boat, institutions and artists, and a boat that is likely to get a lot of holes in the near future.
Can I add one? Can I
please,
add one more?
Please do, Andy.
Thing. So there was actually one thing for folks to be aware of and to pay attention to is that there was actually an effort on that was started by the artist Tatiana Vahan right here in Los Angeles to take a Los Angeles artist census about the living conditions of Los Angeles artists. This was before the shutdown. And as the shutdown started happening, the census closed off. The idea was that they could build a data set that could be comparative, that could show kind of what the economic conditions of artists are after, the shutdown and what they were before. And that data is going to be, or is soon released, and will allow people, I think, to give some kind of measure stick, at least here in Los Angeles, about kind of the situation for artists. They got, I think, hundreds and hundreds of responses from artists here in LA. It's not a perfect data set. It's not like a sociologically perfect kind of
but
thing.
It's a start. But
it's really important. And I think people can kind of look out for that in the coming months.
Right. And I think also in an important way, shift the public's perception as well as the art world's perception about what it means to be a practicing artist in the 21st century, and also what it means to be involved in the art and cultural landscape. I mean, it's very much a privileged environment to be a part of. It's a very much a privileged environment to work in. But I think that like with all things, when you're inside of it, there are quite a lot of trade-offs, many of them having to do with the economics and the social conditions that we all contend with in order to make the machine run, which I'm sort of curious about because, Enrique, when I was listening to you talk, and Andy too, it seems like the pandemic is also creating a moment where we are undoing or looking past some of the customs or the mores or the taboos that went along with the operations of the art world, both commercial and nonprofit. Now realigning certain value systems and thinking about what's important. I think you both brought up the situation with the museums, not just here in Los Angeles, but we're seeing this around the country. The American Association of Museum Directors published a set of guidelines saying that no museum directors were going to be sanctioned if they used restricted funds or proceeds from deaccessioning works, which is a fancy way of saying selling work, to fund operations. And I thought that was a very interesting first step because it sounds administrative, but it begins to make one think about what the value systems and the missions of some of these institutions are, which are to collect and preserve and conserve cultural history, right? But in the face of actual human suffering, right? The lives of the individual that work at these institutions and need the income and need the healthcare and these other things. All of a sudden, it's a question about how closely you're going to hold on to that cultural property in favor of seeing some of your personnel have to leave the museum or go on to do other things. I wonder, are there things that you have been rethinking, any kind of closely held beliefs that you've had prior to this, which all of a sudden have come to a moment where you said, oh, you know what? I wonder if that's truly as important to be involved with, to accept going forward after this is all done.
Yeah, I mean, to quote that great philosopher Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face, and I think there's a tendency sometimes for some aspects of the art world to be comfortably making decrees from very high up, when in fact, when problems happen, such as this one, that the pain is broadly felt. Although, to clarify it, I think it's important to clarify this point here. Unlike, say, the Black Plague or something like this, this has hit the wealthy different than it has hit the poor aspects of society. And because many artists are hovering typically quite often in sort of lower echelons of society, we have to realize that it's very different how these layoffs and things feel for people who had 1 month maybe of backup versus people who didn't. And people who can shelter themselves very easily or go somewhere and isolate themselves in privilege and have everything brought to them, that people have to scramble around. So it's important that we realize that this pandemic is not a uniform, symmetrical pain all around. So coming back to your question and what you're bringing up, I think it offers opportunities because there's an aspect of desperation to the moment. Mm-hmm. So if artists don't decide to go out into the world, either through creating events in the studio, through that they interact with the rest of the world, or through Instagram or to Zoom or whichever it is, then their isolation, alienation just increases. There's no opportunity for conversations, for exhibitions, for discourse. And that discourse is what sort of motivates and fuels our production quite often. So you begin to sort of do a lot of navel gazing in your studio if you don't try to get out there. I think I would like to think that this may be something that stays more permanently as a feature of the art world. I think artists, for all the iconoclastic myth, are quite often willing to allow gatekeepers to have their voice. And I think artists here are taking the voice themselves. And it has been interesting how institutions, how galleries have actually promoted artists talking in their studios, giving studio tours and things like that. So the direction is moving from those institutions, from those galleries, to the more private spaces of artists. And hopefully this be something that remains, because I think people respond to it. I think maybe the longest lasting, hopefully the longest lasting effect of this, I would like to think, is that maybe some of the triviality and banality of a lot of the artwork that has fueled markets for the last 10 years perhaps will sort of thin out a little bit, because it will seem so inconsequential in the face of deaths and famine as is happening in parts of the world. Just real pain. I think people are a little bit tired of seeing this sort of clever, cynical positions, and maybe they will seem tired in this moment.
Yeah, Andy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I had seen the same report that you had cited, Jonathan, and I think for anybody who watches art in its various institutions, that's such a remarkable statement. Institutions are made up of people, right? I mean, I think it sounds maybe like, I don't know, basic to say, but what I've noticed in terms of looking at arts institutions is that the people that are still able to be working inside of those institutions are doing everything they can to, oftentimes, to highlight, to promote, to siphon, money, funds, attention to the artists that they would have been working with kind of anyway. So I've seen a lot, just like you kind of said, Enrique, I've seen a lot of really incredible conversations with artists kind of that take place in their studios or in their homes, and give a kind of extra dimension of kind of that kind of thing that we look for in the discourse around art, which is a kind of engagement with, life and the work of art and, all of that stuff. But I think you know, institutions are going to need to have a flexibility during this time. I think the deaccessioning question is really interesting. Although on the flip side, I would ask, if the markets are depressed, then where is that deaccessioning money going to come from, right? Like, I mean, I think like it creates this kind of chicken egg situation with kind of that question. So if I were a museum director, I would look at deaccessioning even during this time as kind of an imperfect solution, right? Deeply flawed solution, but I also understand kind of why that loosening of guidelines exists in this case, right?
Well, my solution to that is that, along with all the other federal bailouts that are coming, you could buy the work from the various different institutions and put it on display in the National Gallery, where the part of the contract sale that it would always have to be on view.
Sure. But I also think that one of the things that collectors or people who regularly donate to institutions, if we're talking about museums collecting institutions, I mean, the Kunsthalle model is like a totally different kind of beast in some ways. But if we're talking about collecting institutions, you know, I know that people are hit hard in their pocketbooks and in their investment portfolios and kind of all of that stuff in the collector class. But, you know, this is the time really where they should be reaching out to those institutions, because we do not have the system that you said, Jonathan, when there is actual kind of government, like really robust support for the arts and for kind of collecting institutions. You know, those collectors really do need to be reaching out to museums and asking, what can I do during this time to support you and make sure that you stay alive?
Right.
You know, that is to me the onus of a collector during this time.
And I think that speaks to something Enrique was saying, is that as much as there's going to be a painful kind of clearing out of maybe some of the cynicism and some of the let's call it, for lack of a better word, the dead wood, that you'll see a recommitment on the part of philanthropists and collectors and people who really are dedicated to the art, the institutions, and the history, for something more than sort of status seeking or some of the other, let's say, less desirable but certainly understandable plays that go on within the art world.
I really hope so.
Yeah. We've got some very interesting questions that are coming over our Q&A from the audience, and so I'm gonna turn to some of these. I think one of the things that is often that has been coming up during the current pandemic is comparisons to the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. And we know that there's quite a lot of interesting work that came out of that moment, of course, almost inextricable from other global upheavals like World War I. But I'm curious, what are some of the lessons or some of the things that the audience or a public might be looking out for from artists, and that they could draw parallels to the kinds of things that we saw in 1918 and the brief aftermath there? Enrique, you want to start with that? Yeah.
I immediately think of that amazing painting by Munch, where he's sitting on his chair and the painting is called Painting with
Spanish flu.
The Spanish flu. So, you know, sort of, and what you see in Munch's face is what in some ways we hear in the news is the fear, the sense of vulnerability, the aloneness. So I think artists, I mean, the same is true, not just during the Spanish flu. I mean, I think we tend to think of, for example, during the early Renaissance through, say, the 17th century with the Black Plague, that all the paintings and all the responses of artists will always be dark because there's so much death around. But in fact, all the beautiful luminous paintings of the Renaissance were created in the shadow of the Black Death. And even Titian, who died from the Black Plague, made spectacular life-affirming paintings on that. And I think the same was true during artists react not only by mirroring what is happening in terms of destruction, but also by offering possibilities, by often offering new ways to look through the darkness of what's happening around us. And I think that is one of the attributes that art has that we could take advantage of at this time, when mostly what we hear is desperation and fear, or to be honest, lies.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree wholeheartedly with Enrique. I mean, I really feel like those are all such great examples that he pulled up of kind of thinking through kind of artists' relations to kind of pandemics. I think the other historical moment that's been coming up a lot, obviously, and it doesn't seem to have a lot to do with artists, but it certainly does, is the Great Depression, right? And we're likely going to experience at least a very rough recession or depression kind of after this. There was a comment in our like comment feed about kind of establishing something like a WPA now, for kind of, I imagine, lots of sectors or areas of public life. And yeah, I mean, that's what I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to the kinds of conversations that we have about what a public is or can be, what a nation is or can be, what a community is or can be. And artists are a part of that, that really important dialogue. I mean, artists give visual and material form to kind of various aspects of that. So I think, if we look at something like the Great Depression and the WPA that came out, artists, some of our kind of best known, kind of canonical, kind of the pale male kind of dude history of art history, Jackson Pollock was a muralist. Like, I mean, major artists were kind of supported and funded through government and federal programs. And I think, we should be on the lookout and be advocating for that as part of a really robust portfolio of responses from both kind of local, regional, national, and international governments.
I think it's a really interesting point, especially from, again, this kind of the disabusing the mythology of the sort of solitary, the solitary genius, or the single-mindedness of the artistic persona, moving more towards collaborative and collective activities, which often come out of these processes. And it doesn't have to be, it's not always advocacy or activist minded. It can simply be as much as, the constant dialogue and the discourse, I think also that Enrique, you were mentioning. I think one of the sort of collectives that's in the background here is education. And I wanted to ask you both, as educators of artists and more, as a young, for lack of for better or worse, idealistic individuals who want to make a mark on the world. What are some of the things you have said, are thinking about saying? What are some of the resources that you are pointing your students towards? Understandably, as you conduct your classes over Zoom and in this distributed way. But I'm curious, and I think our audience would be curious as to what's some of the advice that you've been, or the strategies you've been mounting as educators as you go forward.
I have been sort of trying as much as I can to maintain the sense of community that existed, when the students were at the campus and where we're standing around together in a room through Zoom. It's not easy. And I think it is likely that many of the students feel that they're missing out some part of their education, that they have lost, especially when they're seniors and this was their graduating semester. It's a tough moment for them. My daughter is a senior graduate from high school, missing all the usual rituals of a high school graduation. So I think as faculty, we have to sort of try to rise to the occasion if we can, to not just teach our classes, but see what else we can do, to activate the sense of community. I find myself talking to them before the actual class starts, a little bit more about what's happening with their lives than I normally would do. And I think part of that is because I am interested, but also I want them to hear them talk to each other, because they're no longer really talking to each other in the conventional sense. And I think this is colleges and universities around the country are struggling. in many ways, partly for the same reasons the museums are struggling. There many small colleges are likely to close. I think I read somewhere around like 80 colleges, small colleges are likely to close during this period. I mean, the San Francisco Art Institute, a great institution, closed. So
Right.
I think this is a moment that we all have to think about how to support. I mean, American higher education is an example to the world. And I think we have to do whatever we can to keep it shining as it has been for a long time.
So I would add, in addition to kind of what Enrique spoke beautifully to, which is kind of like, I feel the same way about kind of the need to protect and preserve a sense of community or a sense of belonging during this time. But I would add, you know, what I'm seeing reflected back from my students, of course, like everyone else, is a lot of anxiety. And I think that goes in a lot of directions, from I can't get motivated to work, you know, which I am finding really difficult at this time too, to I don't want to make virus art, you know, like a kind of like, I don't want to respond to this crisis. Like I don't want my art to be over determined by what's going on in the world at this time. And I 100% understand, you know, and sympathize with that as well. And I also think it needs, I mean, there's another part of this, which is like, as faculty, both Enrique and I, our relationship to our institution. So, you know, it is incumbent upon us, upon folks at Dornsife, on folks at Roski, on all the art schools at USC, to really make the argument to our own school that, you know, this is going to affect areas in uneven and unequitable ways, and that a school's, you know, a central administration's job is to make sure that all parts of the school are being cared for and taken care of kind of during this time. So, you know, one of the things that I hope we see in our own university, in our own university context, is a rethinking of some of the ways in which kind of economics work within the university, right? Because, you know, art studio classes cannot happen, you know, remotely. Like it just, you know, like it is, there is no middle ground, you know, I mean, people will find the middle ground, but there really is no middle ground. And students, as Enrique were saying, are losing out on really important experiences of critique, of looking, of engaging, right? And so I do think that there needs to be an acknowledgement kind of that, even from within our own kind of institutional context as well.
It's an interesting point. It brings up a kind of like a hierarchy of need, and
Right.
the way that those hierarchies are addressed. And actually, one of our attendees has a question that runs along those lines. And I'm gonna shift to that question a little bit. This is someone who has been looking for patrons to produce some new work in collaboration with other artists. And has been getting pushback, it sounds like, saying, listen, this is not such a good look when people are still going out there for emergency funds and we're trying to find money to produce work. Mm-hmm. So the original question is there a crowdfunding platform, you know, for this kind of thing, for art production? You know, apart from things like GoFundMe or Kickstarter or maybe something like that, maybe this is an opportunity for exactly this kind of maybe an arts-focused production type of fund that makes this distributed. But I'm sort of curious to hear your thoughts on not so much what the platform would be, but how do you make the argument for doing the work that you need to do as an artist, even at a moment when you know that this thing is affecting people differently, and you want to recognize that, but at the same time, you feel like you have to do the work that you need to do. You have to produce. You can't stop living. That would be my argument. but I'm curious to hear from you, Andy, and hear from you, Enrique. So this is, in a way, it's sort of that, how do you get that motivation and demonstrate to people that they have the agency and they can do this while recognizing the conditions around them?
Yeah, I mean, I think Enrique would be the best one to address this because of you know, production and artwork. I mean, like, I think like that's a central question I have for you too, Enrique. Yeah.
I mean, I think there has always been this question, what happens? Can you write poetry after Auschwitz? You know, can you create in a condition of where you feel that it seems almost silly to take on the work of an artist or a poet? And to me, it always is a reconsideration of what is it that you're doing and why you're doing it. I think seeing the suffering of other people, seeing people struggling, and coming to your studio and creating something becomes an imperative. The surrounding conditions become an imperative to say, well, why am I making this work? What is the point to make this work when there is all these conditions and suffering going on in the world? And I think your work, at least in my point of view, your work has to provide some sort of answer to it. Not necessarily an answer that goes along with it, like you were saying, and the idea, you don't have to make viral art,
Right.
but somehow your work has within it cooked a certain response, a certain conversation with the larger problematic of the moment. And I think many works confronted with tragedies, confronted with significant shifts in social beliefs, prove themselves to be insignificant and not live up to the challenge of the change of time. And we have in the history of art many examples of that. So the question for each artist when you come to your studio is this is an opportunity to reconsider, reflect, reevaluate, and decide why is it that you're an artist and what does that imperative say about the kind of work you're going to make during this time, who you're going to interact with, how you're going to scramble. If you have no funding, then you make work that requires no funding. I mean, artists have always found ways around the situation with funding. And I'm not pretending that it's easy to do any of this. It's in fact very hard. But sometimes very hard is also an opportunity to reconsider what we do and why we do it.
Yeah, and I would only add to that that like in this time, I've been encouraging artists. I mean, there are some artists who do absolutely need to hustle to make rent, to make all, you know, to make all of their bills. And, you know, you, like Enrique says, like there is no other option when you're up against the wall. And that way you kind of have to do what you can do to make sure that you can survive. But I've been reminding artists to be careful with themselves and to not be give themselves a lot of grief if they feel like they haven't been able to kind of work at the speed or in the same way that they have, you know, previous to this. I think like Enrique, I encourage artists to pay attention to what their response is and to like, just like anybody else, and to make sure that you're thinking through it and getting the care that you need. That's mental health care, physical health care, you know, all of those things that I think are so important. But yeah, I mean, like there's a way to talk about what's going to happen in relation to this pandemic that is not going to be overly reductive for the art. So like, for example, so many artists live in precarity and poverty, and yet we never talk about poverty when we talk about the work of art itself, even though it's been conditioned in its making by the circumstance of poverty, right? So like there's a way that we can kind of pull in an analytic around kind of like what our situation is today. And I think this will happen down the line. I don't think we need to kind of really spend our energy and focus really doing it right now, but you know, the historical view will be, you know, like that many artists change the shape of their practice, subtle to not so subtle, you know, in response to what is going on now.
Yeah, that dovetailed nicely with another question that we've got from one of our attendees, and this is something that I resonate with too. Photography and video and the lens arts, if we want to call them that, have often been the things that have sort of blossomed most or been very effective tools and mediums, particularly with crises or crisis-like conditions. In my own experience, I remember a research trip to Israel some time ago and finding that the artists that had been working there for some time had the photographers and video practitioners were very extraordinarily advanced in comparison to their colleagues who were working in painting and drawing and things like that. And you can imagine maybe some of the conditions that would lead to that. What's your sense of how, and so this is also a way of asking, I was going to ask Enrique a sort of very specific question, but what do you think this will do for how photography has been addressed and how it plays a role in the larger history, not just of art, but let's say of social history as it relates to these pandemics and these crises?
I mean, I think photography, like you were saying, I mean, the portability of it, the ability of photography to not burden you with so much of the materiality of paintings or sculptures, give you a flexibility and makes you nimble in situations of stress. And also, I think we are, as a society, very sensitized to image making in a way that perhaps we're not sensitized in the same way to paintings and sculptures. So the response of photography is a response that I think the public, to different degrees, is familiar with. And that in some ways makes photography the vernacular in some ways of the moment, in a way that sometimes painting and sculpture may seem archaic or arcane in some manner. So I think there's a power of photography for there, and also photography has a relationship with, time and past and future and grief recorded onto the very nature of that distance between the present and the past, which lends itself naturally to something like this. But sometimes that opens possibilities for other mediums as well. I think painting, sculptures, performance, things that are not so obvious in this environment could blossom in situations like this, precisely because there's so much resistance to them.
Yeah, I'm really excited about performance personally. Like I really think that there's some amazing kind of opportunities for that. But I would add that photography also, a photography teacher or instructor or professor would tell you, too, that like photography, just like anything else, has a materiality too. So does video, right?
Sure.
And so like, of course, as we share images, that are disarticulated from the actual objects that might get made by artists, right? Like we also just want to be aware that like half of that photographer's way of thinking about their work is is stumped, I really think the material question with photography, when I look at photography, one of the things that I really try to think about a lot is materiality, right? And that kind of is kind of out the door at this point, just like with kind of sculpture and painting and kind of everything else, right?
Right. So I think final question here, because we've reached our 1 hour mark. Any out of the ordinary practices, habits, things that you've picked up during quarantine that you think you may stick with? Enrique?
I think the ability to not see anybody is a new skill. But I think for artists, I think we work in somewhat isolated environments and not see a lot of people. So this is not completely new. But I think that being able to survive with such little input is an interesting discovery. I think that myself and many people have had during this period.
Yeah. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I think as we're talking about this, what is likely to be a really devastating economic crisis, I know it's not maybe so helpful to say, but one of the things that I've been paying attention to is like my expense output, and understanding that like I don't have to be as like always looking to buy something or have something, right? Like, I've been pretty thoughtful about what it is that I ask and buy and receive. And so,
right.
I'm hoping that some of that ethic can transfer And maybe some of those funds can be used towards the aims that I kind of stated at the beginning, which is, okay, it's time to really support artists and their institutions.
Right. We're all learning to become starving artists, hermits and frugal at a moment when we need to do exactly the opposite, be collaborative and generous. Well, listen, I want to say thank you very much, Andy. Thank you very much, Enrique. This was a great conversation. I hope that everybody on the line enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'm sure that USC Dornsife will want you to join for the next dialogue. So I hope you're well, and take care.